A couple of hundred years ago, when the British first arrived in Tasmania, they found a wild and beautiful island. Today, it's hard to imagine the brutal past of this place. Here, the Aboriginal people were massacred, and the British built their most savage prisons. I've come to isolated Macquarie Harbour to retrace the steps of one of the most notorious escapes in convict history. Well, this is Cape Sorel on the west coast of Tasmania, and it's a pretty wild and woolly looking coastline, cold one too, I can tell you. This here is the harbour entrance to Macquarie Harbour, and that's where they established the convict settlement. I guess when you look at it all and feel it all, it's no wonder they called it Hell's Gates. This is where the convicts arrived. From the open sea, through the gates of hell, into Macquarie Harbour. You can see just why they chose this part of Tasmania for a prison. The environment itself formed the prison walls. Endless mountain ranges on one side and the Southern Ocean on the other. They reckoned escape from here would be impossible. In 1822, the convict settlement was built on Sayre Island, at the top end of the harbour. The only way I can get to Sayre Island is by water, leaving from the old fishing village of Strawn, near the entrance to the harbour. Ready to go bush?
Yeah, great day
or whatever
on the
you
west
call
coast.
it in nautical terms.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Going to be good?
A nice sail, yeah, head off down the harbour.
Right.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sounds all right. It's an eerie feeling to think that this is the way those convicts made their first journey up this harbour. One of the crewmen today is Richard Davey. He's an expert on what life was really like for those unfortunate convicts.
They were going to punish people here by simply unremitting labour. Because it was so inefficiently run and morale was so low on everybody's part, military, civilian, convict alike, as soon as you get someone who irritates you, you flog him. Yeah. So that it was brutal, it was bashing, it was just dog-eat-dog stuff here in the early years. When they first came here, there probably were about 1 million swans on this harbour.
Is that right?
Yeah, and they used to hunt them. I mean, partly the soldiers hunted them just for recreation or for out of boredom. Yeah. And at one stage, they actually had to issue a command not to shoot anymore because they thought they'd wipe them all out. There's a description of a meal. This was an officer's mess sort of meal, but it was baked swan.
You got to watch them officers.
Stuffed wombat. Right. Baked swan, stuffed wombat, fried echidna. They're into it. I mean, they really did eat quite well down here once they got it going.
There were some things that weren't allowed to eat though, weren't they? Or weren't allowed to cook.
They weren't allowed to cook biscuits. Yeah. I mean, biscuits, not meaning peat-free creams. No, we're talking about hard-tack biscuits. Yeah. But that was escape tucker. That was stuff to take with you. You could store them up. If you could find somewhere to stash them, you could store enough rations in the biscuit to get you. So Governor Arthur made an absolute rule, no biscuits. No biscuits were to be baked on the island at all.
After 3 hours, we reach our destination, Sayre Island. I'm following in the path of a convict called Alexander Pearce. An Irishman, Pearce was initially transported to Tasmania for stealing 6 pair of shoes. Well, it was somewhere around here, back in 1822, August, Alexander Pierce landed. He didn't know it then, but he was about to start writing himself into the history books. Alexander Pierce never responded well to the firm hand of British authority. He absconded in Hobart, forged some documents, and stole a glass from a local pub. He was sent here to serve out the rest of his sentence. Today, there's not much left but the ghosts of one of the harshest places in the British Empire. Designed to break the toughest man, this was a scene of constant flogging and misery. The man behind it all was Governor George Arthur. An unforgiving man, he wanted an even worse place of punishment for convicts who wouldn't toe the line. Sarah Island was stripped of all its vegetation, creating a windswept and bleak world. Apart from the floggings, the most gruelling punishment was the daily workload. Six days a week at sunrise, work parties of convicts left the island. Some rode to the top end of the harbour and up the Gordon River. They were after the precious Huon pine. It grew in the rainforest along the riverbanks, and it's still here today. Well, this is what the convicts were looking for. This is a Huon pine. It's a magnificent specimen, this one. They reckon it's around about 2,000 years old, and these trees don't even mature until they're about 500 years old. Might wonder how come it's still here if the convicts were cutting them all down. Well, I reckon that this tree didn't suit what they were after. They were after wood to make ships out of, and they wanted tall, straight trees. This one's got a few lumps and bumps and knots in the side of it and wouldn't have suited them. This whole story was recreated in an Australian silent film, a classic called For the Term of His Natural Life. The men would work like this right through the winter, often up to their necks in freezing water. Returning to the island at nightfall, the worst prisoners were forced to wade ashore and sleep in their wet clothes. It's no surprise that there were many attempts to escape from these hellish conditions. After just 1 month here, Alexander Pierce was in a work party at Kelly Basin. He decided he'd had enough. Well, this is Kelly Basin. And on that day, Pierce and half a dozen of his mates were over here cutting Huon pine. And they made a decision. They decided to escape. Of course, the only way out of here is via the harbour. First thing they did was pinch a couple of boats, a bit like this old piner's punt here. They didn't have much in the way of supplies, virtually nothing in fact, but the one thing they did have was an axe. The 7 men made their way to the west, along the harbour to the convict coal works. There they stole some supplies and were joined by another escapee, Robert Greenhill. But thinking they were being followed, they panicked and they put ashore here. the first thing they did was bash up the boats and ruin them. Then they took off. They had to travel all through that wilderness country, all those mountains and the rivers and everything. Of course, they had no bush skills and they had no supplies. They had no maps. They really were just feeling their way. But I guess when you think about it, they probably felt that just about anything would have to be better than staying on Sarah Island. Well, normally that'd be the case, but not this time. The convicts had no idea of just how far this journey might be. To them, the mountains looked distant, but quite climbable. To their horror, the 8 men quickly discovered what lay ahead of them. Their clothes were torn, their feet reduced to pulp, and morale collapsed. Little did they know that their ordeal would be dramatised over 100 years later. Between the scrub, there was rainforest where the going was a bit easier. But it wasn't long before desperate hunger set in. There is bush tucker hidden here, but a newcomer, like me, can take a while to find it. Have a look at that. Isn't that delightful? It's a thing called a native currant. Beautiful little thing. Just like a raspberry or blackberry. Nice sweet little thing. There's plenty of it around here. It's grown all around the riverbank, all around the place here. But of course, those convicts, like me, wouldn't have known about this sort of thing. Not their country either. They would have walked through here. At the time they came through, this wasn't in season, so they would have missed out on it. It certainly is worth knowing about. Delightful. Open rainforest soon gave way to horizontal scrub. Countless layers of fallen and matted trees and undergrowth. Saturated and cold, their progress was pathetic. On the 8th day, in desperation, 3 of them turned back. The rest carried on, but just as they got past one barrier, there was yet another to break their spirits. Today, there's a 4-wheel drive track through this part of the country. It was built back in the days when they were surveying this area for a dam. It's all right for me driving up here, but just imagine clambering up here on foot, only to be confronted with this. By now, things were getting desperate, and they had to cross the Franklin River up ahead here.